My name is Xiyang Chen, and I work at Rangle as a software developer. Today I'm going to be talking about writing testable and shareable code in AngularJS. So let's first talk about a little bit of motivation. Why you want to write testable and shareable code. Oh, by the way, I'm not going to be diving to test specifically, because I think there has been a lot of great review, tutorials online. In fact, I think our first speaker, Alan, I'm not sure if he's here. I think he uploaded a test tutorial for Karma. I think that's great, and I suggest you guys check it out. So what I'm going to be talking about is really if you are going to be thinking ahead, if you're going to be thinking ahead of time, like as you write code, like what are some of the things you can do to kind of preemptively save yourself from a lot of the trouble. And these are some of the points that I've collected through my experience with writing code myself and working with clients. So, but let me talk about a little motivation first. So, I think I don't claim to be, have some kind of noble goals. So my motivation for writing testable code is pretty simple. So as you can see, I want adequate test coverage for my and my team's code base, so I can enjoy a quality sleep schedule during the week, as well as a tranquil and uninterrupted weekends. So that's my primary motivation. And the other motivation is I want my code to be clear, readable, and reusable with clearly defined specs, so that my colleagues or the succeeding dev team will be appreciative of my work and thus offer to buy me a beer from time to time for saving their time and money. And number 3 is I want a testable and maintainable code so that my stakeholders' interest is taken care of. And I think it is my belief that if you take care of motivation number 1 and number 2, motivation number 3, oftentimes it will be helpful towards motivation number 3. So what I'm going to do next is, actually the objective. So if we derive that motivation, so what translates to practical and technical terms is we want to write front-end code that's friendly for unit and E2E testing, preferably right off the bat. But we can always refactor later as we go. And we want to keep a maintainable and shareable code base. So those are the 2 objectives. And for the remainder of time, I'm just going to go rapidly through all the points. And if you don't get some of those, I will make this slide available online later. The first, number 1 thing that I think I've seen a lot, and this is what I believe is the number 1 enemy of writing testable code, is big, giant, fat controllers. So I'm going to show you an example later, shortly. And instead of writing all the business logic into the controller, it is most of the times better to write them into services. And another related point is controllers. There should be no DOM manipulation in controllers. And instead, if you find yourself using DOM manipulation, I think those code is usually better placed in either service or a directive. So I hope it's a typical example of a controller that I can see. I see. So as you can see in here, basically the controller has a dependency of HTTP, which in my opinion is a red flag here, because I will know if you use HTTP inside your controller, it probably means those things are related to business logic, and you should come probably into a service. So so yeah, that's the example. So instead of doing all this transform and everything here, I think this piece of logic should go into a service and use defer and promise pattern to better handle it. And the second point is group code into bundles, aka modules, because separation of functionalities makes it easier to isolate and troubleshoot errors when you are running tests. And how do we modularize our code? I think there are two ways. The first way is what some people call vertical modularization. So you can put your app, modularize your app this way and group everything, all my services into a module, all my filters into a module, all my controllers into a module which is dependent on services and filters. Or we can modularize in terms of functionality, features, and our business logic. And wait, this one shouldn't be. Sorry, just ignore this part. Let's just look at this part. And so in here's an example. If we have an external API, a JavaScript API that we use for our front-end code, I'll probably just put it into a company API module by itself, and then later, okay, there should be only one here. Sorry about that. Yeah, so if we have some logic related to the products that the company produces, we can declare it as a separate module. Or maybe we have another module that's related to personnel logic, and we put them into a separate module. The next tip is all external references should come from dependency injections. And if you happen to have a third-party library, so I think in general, if you want to do it really the Angular way, my opinion is there shouldn't really be any global vars. The exception, one of the exception is if you have external library that's say underscore or say some of the time manipulation library, and you can put them into Angular value or Angular constant and inject them as needed. So here is a example. So say you have a third-party library. If you run this in the browser, it's probably going to be, I think it's going to be attached to the window object. So usually you can call this directly. But when you start doing tests, you have all these external dependencies that's not explicitly declared, and which makes it hard to write test code. What I think a better way is you explicitly make this make a separate service for it, and during your when you start using the service code, you just inject third-party library into your service. So during the tests, you can easily mock this library out. Just mock it up, and so that it behave. It only returns what you expected within the context of that test. And if you find yourself writing a large controller or a large service, and it's usually for controller, it is often the case you can actually break them into smaller sub-controllers. And for services, each service, in my opinion, should have a single responsibility. I come from a object-oriented background, so I tend to write a very huge and large object that has a lot of method attached to it. I think you don't necessarily need to do that in Angular, so you can break them down to smaller services that only serve one particular purpose. I'm going to show you a few examples later. And here's an excellent point that from the article I read. I forgot the type, but I'm going to show that in the reference. Eliminate the word "and" in your service description. So if your service has an "and" wording, it means it's probably doing two things. So you can probably break it down into smaller things, like two smaller pieces. Service should be loosely coupled. And this is, I think it's a example of a tightly coupled service. which makes it more difficult to test. Because as you can see, this service has basically three, oh, there's a grammar error here. This two should be quoted. There are basically three external dependencies here. HTTP, which is the Angular service, and the card. Oh wait. And stats engine. And inside services, you have a lot of methods. The service can get your product and update the product and get the statistics of the product and maybe add a product to the cart. And when you start writing a mock or a test for this service, you're going to have to mock all these three objects at the same time. And that's just usually a pain in the butt to write. So a better approach would probably just break them down into three separate services. And this is one of my favorite. I use the routes and resolve pattern. This is not exclusively for Angular, because I think this is also, I've seen similar things in Media, and I believe probably some of the other JavaScript framework too. So essentially the way it works is divide you, when you try to load some service, say the example in my mind is a product. You want to load a single product. You want to go to this item, go this, you want the item, like maybe the description of the item, it can be a product. And you use the resolve function, resolve object, what is it called? Option to explicitly declare, I want this item, and I want item loader to load it, and it's going to during the routing time, it's probably not going to be ready, so I return it as a promise. And if you declare things that way, so in your controller, you can directly reference your items, and by the time it goes to the controller, the item will be ready, and it will no longer be a promise. I think it will no longer be a promise, and you can just directly call it. So as you can see, if you do it this way, it's good for end-to-end testing, because you can just load, during end-to-end testing, you can just load a specific route with all the parameters you have. Then you are at the state that you need. And so those are, I think those are the big items. So, and here are some like small tips that I'm just go through very rapidly. Some of the things you probably know. The first one is use $window, $location, $interval instead of window, location, and the set interval function provided by JavaScript. So it's by the same principle, so that your dependencies are isolated, and you find the easier time if you want to end up mocking those services. So those are available for Angular. And by the same token, and this use $log, and not only is it easier for isolation, it also prevents, instead of using console log, so that your test will, when you run the test, you will not see a whole bunch of like debugging information on your console screen. And just in case you don't know, Angular has its own copy, extend, and for each function. So you may want to check that out instead of hastily trying to load the external libraries such as underscore or Lodash. Those are really great libraries. I really love those. But just for the sake of eliminating dependencies, if those are sufficient, then you might as well just use them. And I think this, wrap external JS library into their own minimal services. So say you, as opposed to, if you have an API and you try to define a whole lot of functions into that service. I think this is a repetition of my previous point. And if you guys know as $timeout, you might notice I did not mention $timeout in my previous slides. That is because there has been a known issue with $timeout, when you try to do end-to-end testing, and the result is it's gonna, like when you run end-to-end testing, and if you start assign timeout, it's just gonna, the test is gonna time out without returning any results. So that's just some heads up that hopefully will save you some time. Like it took me like, I don't know, 1 or 2 hours to figure it out. And yeah, I think that's it. So here are some of the external resources that this presentation and basically part of my experience is based on. The first one is the Angular best practice and anti-pattern wiki page that I suggest you check out. The second one is, I find this pretty useful. It's Joe Ames' AngularJS Best Practice. It's a video course on pluralsight.com that I find really useful. It talks explicitly, specifically about a lot of the best practice. What I'm focusing on is just for writing testable code, but it has a lot of other great suggestions. And there's another article, I think was written by one of the Google consultants, if I remember correctly. That has some general guidelines and principles about how to write testable code, and that I found pretty useful. And the final one is testable JavaScript, which is a book, and I think it was using YUI as an example as a testing framework, but I think those principles can be, a lot of those principles can be generalized into, getting a better understanding of how to write a testable code. And that's it. So if you want the slides, I just upload that slides to that address, which is my GitHub account. Or I think I'll probably tweet my slides when I fix all the typos in here. So yeah, sorry about the typos. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.